All right, this is a video on market structures part 2. So we're going to look at this one, monopolies and oligopolies. So first, let's talk about economies of scale. So they talk about this in the book. Economies of scale: when a firm's startup costs are high and its average cost falls for each additional unit that's produced. So when you have a firm that has high startup costs, but every time they produce one more unit, the average cost per unit goes down dramatically, that gives you economies of scale. And I'll illustrate that in a graph. And the cost drop as production increases. So every time you produce something else, your average costs go down. So we don't see that too often with pure economies of scale, but we'll see an example of graphing. So if we're going to illustrate this idea of economies of scale, we can look at the production of a good. So we can say, let's say whatever this good is, let's say there's a fixed cost involved in the production. And let's say in this scenario, the fixed cost is $700. No matter whether we open or not, whether we produce 1 or 10 goods, our fixed cost is always the same, $700. And that would be things like rent, taxes, something that's, you're always going to pay no matter what. Let's say our variable costs would be, if we produce 1 unit of this, it's going to cost $300 for each unit that we produce. So that's going to include labor, materials, running electricity, all the stuff that will be involved. So our total cost, if we're going to produce 1 unit, 1 unit would be then $1,000, right? So we'd be spending $1,000. The average cost per unit, because there's only one, would be $1,000. If we're going to graph that, we could put that right up here. So then if we were going to make 2 units, our total cost would be $1,300 because we had $700 fixed cost plus $300 per unit, so it's not the $600 we'd be at. So $1,300 total, which means our average cost per unit would be $650. So if we're going to graph that on this line, we'd say, okay, 650 would be roughly about here. So we'd see this fairly big change, right, from producing 1 unit to 2 units. We see a big change in the average cost. It's definitely worth producing a second unit because your costs go down, or your average costs go down. If we're going to then go to producing 3 units, then we would be looking at spending $1,600. So our fixed cost plus the variable cost of producing 3 units, and then our cost would be $530. So we could graph that on here. 530 would be roughly about there or so. So our line would shift that way. And if we're going to produce 4 units, we'd be at $1,900 total. Our average cost would be $480. So that would put us at roughly about here. And then if we're going to produce, I'm only going to do this for 10 units just to illustrate the flattening of the curve. For 5 units, we'd be producing, our total cost would be $2,200. And our average cost then would be $440. So we can graph that, 440, be roughly a little bit below that mark. So what we see so far, if you notice, is that the marginal cost each time we go is decreasing between let me get a highlight here, between $1,000 and $1,300 we saw, I should say between 1 unit and 2 units we saw a decrease of, see what our marginal cost would be about a change of $350 per average cost. But between 2 units and 3 units, we saw then a change that dropped down to, looks like what, about $120. And between 3 units and 4 units, our marginal cost we went from $530 average cost to $480 average cost. So that would be, what's that, about $50. And from 4 units to 5 units, we went down to $40. So we're seeing our marginal average cost decreases every time we produce more because our fixed costs stay the same and our variable costs are going up. If we're going to go to producing 6 units, we would be at $2,500, which means our average cost per unit would be $411. So we have a real flattening of the curve starting to see here. If we were going to go to 7 units, we would be spending $2,800 total, which means our average cost would be $400. Oops. So that would then put us right on this line here. And if we were at 8 units, we'd be at $3,100, which means we'd be at $387. So just below that line there. So I haven't drawn this line super well, but you should see this curving, this swooping down. And then at 9 units, we'd be at $3,400, and then we'd be at $377. So we're going to graph that, and that would be just barely noticeable on this graph. And then our last one at 10 units, we'd be at $3,700, and our average cost would be $370, and we'd be something like that. What we'd see at this line as we swoop down this line, let me see if I can make this a little bit better, right? So as the line swoops down, our costs go down per unit as we go along, but the trend we're seeing here with all these different changes in units is that the marginal change is different, right? Between we went from 40 between 4 units to 5 units, from 5 units to 60. Our average cost is only saving us now $29. Between 6 and 7, it's only saving us $11. Between 7 and 8, it's only saving us, was it like $13? I must have done the math wrong. That doesn't make any sense. It shouldn't go up. Then we go to $10. Then we go to $7. So then we would see this continue. Eventually, what would happen with this line is that the cost. Let me erase some of this stuff here. The cost here, or sorry, the line would eventually start swooping upward, because it would eventually cost more to produce things if we kept going on this trend. If we were in, and it would take forever. Believe me, I've done this. I once, just for the sheer excitement of it, tried to see how many units I would have to sell using this example, and I was like to the point where it's changing like 1/1000th of a cent difference between one of the other. And all I wanted to do was see the point where this line started to swoop back up, and I never got there. I gave up. I think I was on the somewhere around 550 units, and I still hadn't seen an actual increase of price yet. But eventually it would happen. Theoretically, that would happen. There would be an increase. But what we see with economies of scale is that if we were doing this, this line would never go up, right? So if you have a true economies of scale, this line would continue to go down forever, because you would never see the cost become positive. But we can also say with this economies of scale, it doesn't necessarily mean that this line's never going to go up. If we were going to try to erase this for a sec, if we were going to look at different products and stuff, or different companies providing them, you could have one company that might, if it was a small company, might have a line that looks like this. It would increase. The cost would go down. So let me try with this. The cost would go down initially as they were producing, but very quickly, at some point, not too long after production, it would start to increase again. But if we had a company that was producing on a massive scale, that had lots of market power, like a Walmart or an Amazon or something like that, we might see their line look more something like this. And then eventually, down around here, it might start going up. But you would see it happen much later than you would with a smaller firm. So economies of scale doesn't necessarily mean your costs are never going to go up, but you might take longer to get there, and possibly maybe you never get there. Maybe you start production before you get there because you already have so much market power. So we see that's illustrated here with a couple nicer made graphs on from the book and stuff. But economies of scale, some things that you might see with this. Market power is one of the terms they use. The ability to control prices and total market output. So if you have a great share of the market, so if you are a company that produces a ton, you're a big business. I'll use the example of Walmart, right? Walmart's a retailer that's out there and it has a couple of competitors like Target, but has so much market power. So many people buy from Walmart in the store or online, that they have a lot more control over prices than if you just own a business that sells Say, I think I've used the example before of bicycles. If you're a bike shop, you don't have as much control over the prices of your bikes because you don't sell in high volumes. But Walmart does, so they have more control over their prices than a small business would, and they have more control over total market output. If Walmart decides to start selling jigsaw puzzles, they can sell thousands of them versus a small little store. So economies of scale require market power. Something we also see a term in there, predatory pricing. This wasn't in the reading, but it's later on in the chapter in part that I didn't have you read. Predatory pricing is when you sell a product at below cost for a short period of time to drive out smaller competitors, only to raise the price once competition has been eliminated. So you think about that, you have to have market power to do that. A big company, and I'm not, I hate to pick on Walmart, but just that's the example that I'm using. So if you have a company like Walmart, they could open up a store and sell a product like, say, bicycles for below the actual cost. So they could sell them at a loss, but they can handle that because they sell so many other things and they have so much market power. So if they're losing money on bicycles, they're making so much money on board games and garden supplies and DVDs and TVs, whatever it might be, groceries, they can afford to lose a little bit on bikes. And then eventually smaller businesses that can't afford to sell bikes at a loss are going to have to go out of business because they can't compete with Walmart's prices. People will go to Walmart and buy their really cheap bikes rather than buy them at a bike store. But then as far as predatory pricing goes, once the smaller competing businesses have gone out of business, the prices for the Walmart bikes would go up. Now, I'm not saying that Walmart does this. I'm using it as an example. Some people have said they do. I don't know if it's true or not, but that's what predatory pricing is. But these are things that you have to have economies of scale to be able to do that. And here's some types of economies of scale. Technical, if you have large capital equipment with high fixed costs. So if I have a bunch of equipment that's needed to do something, it's going to be harder for somebody else. If I had money and I had always, high startup costs and I bought this technological equipment, it'd be harder for somebody else to start competing with me because they would have to then pay those high startup costs, acquire all that equipment. Specialization, right? If there's special skills needed in production, or if I break down a process into such small little steps that I can really efficiently produce it, it's hard to compete with that otherwise. Bulk buying, if I can buy things in bulk. If I own a restaurant chain and I can buy plastic cups in bulk, I can get better deals than a small little store that's only buying 1,000 of them a month. So buying in bulk can create economies of scale. Marketing, I get the power nationally to advertise stuff. I can take bigger risks because I have more, I have more stores that help me survive if I do something risky and it doesn't work. And there's other ones I won't get so much into, but these are all things of economies of scale. If we look at oligopoly, so we've looked at perfect competition in which we're selling identical goods. There's many buyers, many sellers. There's no barriers to entry, and there's no control over prices. We looked at monopolistic competition, where there are still many buyers and many sellers, but there's some differentiating features with their products. Like I gave the example of Big Mac versus Whopper versus a Wendy's double cheeseburger. There's some difference, or like Nike versus New Balance versus Asics or running shoes. So there's some differences. You have little control over prices, not a lot, but you do have a little bit, and there's some barriers to entry. So, for instance, I can't produce a Nike shoe because Nike has a patent on that particular shoe, but I could create a very similar one. So now we shift to oligopoly. Oligopoly is a market dominated by a few large firms. They have to be profitable. Oligopoly exists when you have when a few firms, 3, 4, maybe 5, that exist, and they produce 70 to 80% of output. So you look at some of the things here. There's a small number of firms. There's some variety of goods, and the book is the example of soda. So we'll talk about that. So we have Coke, Pepsi. I guess those are the two main competitors. There's some other ones in there, but we'll talk about Coke and Pepsi. If I want to, before I get to that, we'll look at barriers of entry. They're high, right? It's very tough to break into a market because of high startup costs or because of technology. And there's some control over prices. More control in an oligopoly than there is in certainly more than a perfect competition where there's no control. And in an oligopoly, you have more control over prices in a monopolistic competition. So if we think about soda, Pepsi and Coke are the two main providers of soda. If I want to start Reno's Soda Company, I'm going to have a hard time because they produce things. First of all, they get economies of scale. They have massive infrastructure and production capabilities. They have massive distribution capabilities. They have market power, right? People know Coke and Pepsi. So if someone's going to go to the store and buy soda and they're looking at Pepsi, Coke, or Reno's Cola, most people can say, I don't know about Reno's Cola, never heard of that. You know, I'll go with the names that I know. I've seen the commercials and things like that. So there's a huge control over this market by a small number of firms. And because of that, if Coke wants to raise its prices to $5 for a 12-pack, then they can become a market leader and do that. And then Pepsi will say, oh, well, they're charging $5, we'll raise our price maybe to, you know, to $4.95, just below theirs. But they're going to be in the same price range, right? It's not going to necessarily be what the actual market value would be. I guess it is because people will demand it, right? But there's, you know, if we got rid of, you know, barriers to entry, if everybody could produce soda and it was really easy to enter that market, then the price of soda would be, you know, down around $2 a 12-pack. So oligopoly, they have some control over prices. Sometimes oligopolies can get in trouble for being what they call colluding. So if you had a couple different companies, like say Coke and Pepsi, were to get together and say, hey, look, people don't want to, you know, we want to get higher prices for our soda. So what if we both agree secretly to keep prices artificially high? We'll charge, you know, $6 a 12-pack, and people are going to have to pay it because they're going to want their Coke and Pepsi. So it's called price fixing, right? So that's illegal. You also have cartels, which are organizations that just openly get together and say that we're going to control prices to what we want, even if it's not what the market would indicate, like for equilibrium price. Those are illegal in the United States, but the book talks about OPEC's a good example of that. The oil-producing countries, that's a cartel. They control, they decide how much they're going to supply and how much they're going to charge. So, you know, it's a cartel. We have those are illegal in the United States because we, you know, believe in the free market. So that's oligopoly. If we look at, then we go to monopolies. Monopolies are when you have one supplier, so there's nobody else supplying a good. You're the only supplier, single seller. There's complete barriers to entry, right? So we have the idea that if you have a monopoly, like say for instance you produce something and you have a patent for it, that you know technology or something like that, nobody else is allowed to produce it. You're the only producer, so there's complete barriers to entry. Your product is unique, so it's something that nobody else could produce. There's nothing else available that's like it. And this always leads to higher prices, right? So you have complete control over prices. You don't have complete control necessarily over, you know, revenue, because people still might not buy it. But you could charge whatever you want because there's nobody to compete with you for it. So if we look at this video on this. So we're going to look at demand and supply and graph this with a monopoly. We'd say that this is a monopoly for, we'll say they give the example in the book in allergy medicine. So if we had one person supplying this because of maybe government patent or copyright reasons, or, you know, whatever it is, I guess a government patent on the research and development of the medicine would be the big thing that would give the an allergy medicine a monopoly. So we have supply here, and we see that supply, over on the supply schedule here, that as price goes up, so does supply, right? So we have this increase of supply as price goes up. And that's a law of supply, right? That producers are willing to supply more at higher prices because they will make more of a profit. So we have that. And then we have, then the opposite of that, of course, is demand. As price goes up with demand, so price increases, we see demand go down, right? So it's a different relationships. We could say that, well, I guess, you know, down, and or at least it's moving in the opposite direction. At a high price at $1,100, only 50 people want to buy it. So see if I can erase those without destroying the rest of this graph. I'll have to write those back in. You get, I foiled it. So it's supposed to be 100. It's supposed to be 50. It must be 1,100. All right. So anyway, so we see in this chart then that our equilibrium price is right here in the middle, and with this monopoly on this medicine, it would be, looks like the price would be somewhere above 500, and maybe just a little bit before 600, 700, 800. So our monopoly price then, if we have a monopoly on this, would be, let's say, $525 for a year's worth. This is for a year's worth of supply, by the way. No, you wouldn't pay $100 for a bottle, right? So for a year's worth of supply, say of an allergy medicine, people, monopoly, they would settle on $525 as a price, and they would supply then looks like 6, 7, a little under 800. So they supply 800 bottles for people to buy per year at that price. So we were thinking about, okay, well, why is this different than if we had a we didn't have a monopoly on this, we could look at this, well, if there's more than one supplier, all these prices would go up, right? We'd have an increase in supply. So we could look over here. This could be our new supply, new quantity supplied. If we didn't have a monopoly, all of a sudden, multiple companies could provide and produce this. So let's say, initially we'd have a little bit of an increase of some of these these quantities because there's more people supplying this medicine. So we see all these numbers go up with an increase of supply. And we would know that this would lead to a change in this demand curve, the supply curve. So at $100, we'd have, let's see, 300 people willing to supply it. At $300, we'd have 700 people willing to supply it. And at, $500, we'd have, 1,000. Oops, right off about there. And at 700, we would have 1,300. See, where's that? Right about here, I think. And then at 900, we'd have 1,700. And at $1,100, we'd have 2,000. So we have to put a new mark there for that, 1,100. So we'd have a supply curve would shift to the right if we had more suppliers, right? So this would be our supply 2. And we know that because of that, price would go down. So if this market were a competitive market, we'd have a lower price. It would be roughly, looks like, maybe about $420. So in a competitive market, we'd have an equilibrium price of $425, and we'd be producing, looks like, about 950 bottles. So if we had a competitive market, we would have a lower price, right? So we have this lower price here, and we'd have more supply. We'd have more medicine available. In a monopolistic market, we have a higher price at $525, and you might say a little bit of a shortage, right? Or less supplied. Monopolies aren't going to supply as much, so they have only 700 bottles in the market. If we think about the way this works, if we were a monopoly, if we were going to ignore this second line, right? So let's get rid of this competitive market. So we're no longer in a competitive market. We're just looking at a monopoly. Get rid of second price there. All right. So if we're going to go back and look at how this would work. When a monopoly decides, if they don't have supply and demand like we've seen with some other ones, right? They don't have these natural forces working with each other. How do they decide what the price is and what the right quantity is? Well, they would look at their marginal revenue and their output and decide on that. So if we're going to look at marginal revenue here, marginal revenue. So we could say at $100, they are going to make $1,400, or say $14,000 in revenue, right? Not profit. We don't know what the cost is. We haven't gotten into that, but they make $14,000 in revenue. At $300, they would make $33,000 in revenue. At $500, they would make $40,000 in revenue. But you see that as we go up, as we go to $700, demand drops so much that they would actually start bringing in less revenue if the prices kept going up. And we see that trend continue at $900. They'd only make, looks like, $900 in revenue. And if they were to charge $1,100, they'd only make $650 in revenue. So you think about why that is. That can be confusing because you think, well, a monopoly is the only provider. They can charge whatever they want. But if they were to charge, let's see, let me change colors here. If they were to charge some crazy amount of money, $900, so let's say this is where the price that they were to decide on, that's great. They can say $900 or you can't buy medicine, but that's not going to make more people want to buy it. There's still only going to be 100 people that want to buy this medicine. Like, you're not going to change their minds. You're going to get the most desperate 100 people that need this medicine that'll pay that much money. So they're not going to sell as much as they would like to, right? So we're not going to quite ever get to a point of real equilibrium, but in this case, they would look at this and say, okay, I use simple numbers here. Looks like we would be more of 525. But after the 500 mark on our graph, we start seeing their revenue decline, and it's not as worth it to them to produce. So a monopoly has to decide, okay, it's never gonna be a completely competitive market. It's never gonna be a competitive market at all because we're the only one supplying the goods. We can't charge as much as we want because people are still not gonna buy it. They're not gonna demand it. Just because we have control over the prices, we can't change demand. So demand then will dictate that at $500 in this case, they would, as we found, $525 would be where they would decide to make 780 bottles to make a profit before revenue started to decline. If they charged any more than $500 or $525, they would start seeing less and less revenue.
So we think about with different kinds of monopolies. There's natural monopolies is one kind. So that's it's not so much of a business that we would see like with if you're producing like medicine or something like that. But a natural monopoly is something that exists when there is only when it's more efficient for one supplier to produce it. And some examples of these would be usually public utilities. Think about like the example of providing public water. If your town allowed private companies to sell and provide public water, that means different companies would have to build reservoirs, or they have to build water treatment centers. They'd have to build different pipes under the ground. They would have competing pipelines to bring water to your house or to your neighborhood. And that's an incredible amount of money to do all that stuff. So you figure that if you were to have competing people or businesses competing to provide water, in order to get your business, they would have to continually lower prices, right, to be competitive. So if they're lowering prices, then they'd get to a point where it wasn't profitable to run a water business, supply business anymore, right? So figure that all the money with the infrastructure, building the pipes and the water treatment plants, if the price of water was so low to be competitive, then there'd be almost no point to doing it. Same thing with electricity. You see that with electricity poles, right? If you have an electric plant that provides electricity and you build these electric poles and you bring, string the wire up and you bring it to all these different neighborhoods, that costs a ton of money. So if a competing electricity company, a supplier of electricity, were to say, well, I'm going to build a bunch of my own electrical poles to compete with you. So you'd have multiple sets of poles, multiple sets of wires. It would cost so much and nobody would be able to produce it. It wouldn't be efficient to produce this product. So because these are natural monopolies, you often see government will allow one business or one organization to provide electricity or water or something along those lines, but then the government will regulate the price since they have a monopoly, so they can't charge you an unfair price to the public. But that's a natural monopoly. Typically for things like this, you have one supplier. You have government monopolies. These are, you can think about that as if you get a patent for an invention, you apply to the government for that, and then you have the sole right to produce and supply that good, or you can charge other people if they want to. So that's a kind of monopoly. We saw that with medicine, with the allergy medicine example. Franchises and licenses, government could issue licenses or franchises to businesses to be the sole provider of a service in an area, like they talked about national parks or things like that, or they talk about giving licenses to like Major League Sports, where they're going to say that we're only going to allow like 30 NFL teams. We're not going to allow any more than 30 NFL teams. So like Montana can't get together and say, hey, let's make an NFL team and just, build a stadium. They get to apply for a license, and the government has given them permission to exclude other suppliers of that to keep the quality of the product good. So here's some examples of where government can provide monopoly opportunities. Price discrimination is one way that when we think about monopolies, they have complete control over prices. But again, that doesn't mean that they're going to make money. So I'm the only one that provides a good and I charge too much for it, nobody's going to buy it. Just because I provide it doesn't mean people are going to buy it. So we'll see with monopolies, they have complete control over prices, and they don't necessarily, the market forces of supply and demand don't affect them as much, but they might change prices for price discrimination. So they might look at different groups of people and say, we're going to offer senior citizens a discount for something. We're going to offer a military discount for something. Or we're going to let kids fly free in our planes to try to attract other people to buy their products. So their regular price will stay artificially high for the average person, but then the prices will be low. I think about this with amusement parks, right? So if you you're going to like a water park and it's the only one within a reasonable distance to anybody going around here, and they're charging $40 to get into the water park, well, that's the average person, but maybe they charge senior citizens $30. So they might say senior citizens aren't going to pay $40 to go to the water park, but they might pay $30. So at least then we'll be able to get their business in here. We'll be able to get them paying for things. So price discrimination is one way for monopolies to adjust prices to attract different groups. If you look at this little chart here, it just shows that, on a spectrum, what more competitive markets or perfect competition on the left, the less competitive markets, monopolies on the right, where there's no competition at all in monopoly. Then it's kind of small. You might have to really squint at that, but that's just a little graphic that kind of shows, the differences between these different monopolies, or these different kinds of market structures. So you can pause that and you can kind of look at that and read through it. Basically, it's just a summary of some of the things that I've talked about. All right. So if you have any questions, let me know. And that will do it for market structures.